Hello, everyone. I am really excited to join NGINX Sprint. My name is Christine Abernathy, and I lead the Open Source Program Office at F5. Now, you may be familiar with NGINX, but unclear how F5 thinks about open source. Well, I'm here to give you more details by taking you through F5's open source journey in 3 parts. Let's get started with this question. Why does a load balancer company care about open source? For history buffs, F5's first product was a load balancer, so this question comes out quite a bit, especially at Open Source Conference. Now, while open source may have played a role at F5 in, say, contributions to the Linux kernel or code shared in F5 developer forums, it was not always a key part of open source strategy. Now, this all changed with the acquisition of NGINX. But why NGINX? F5 has always been in the business of speeding up and securing app delivery. Around 2016 or so, F5 technology was largely consumed as a hardware appliance. To continue to stay relevant as the cloud era was born and was booming, F5 had to expand into these markets. And this is where the acquisition of NGINX in 2019 played a key role. Now, as a leading open source application delivery platform, NGINX prompted F5 to question its own open source engagement and strategy. Given how important NGINX was and is to F5 strategy, getting open source right was key. Following acquisitions of Shape, Volterra, and most recently ThreatStack brought in more companies with strong open source cultures. Open source had to become a key part of F5's transformation strategy. And that's why F5 cares about open source. Now, we believe that open source drives innovation, and innovation is key to accomplishing our mission at F5, which is to secure, deliver, and optimize every app and API anywhere. Here are some interesting stats on innovation that illustrate the fact that the most innovative companies have strong open source practices. And this comes from McKinsey, and it's a report in 2020 talking about developer velocity. And what it showed is that companies in the top quartile, open source adoption actually accelerated innovation. Open source had 3 times the impact on innovation when compared to companies in the other quartiles. The companies that excelled not only used open source, but they had actually made the shift to becoming open source contributors. Given the need to drive innovation while cultivating strong open source practices, F5 decided to create an open source program office, or an OSPO. The OSPO was launched in late 2021. What's an OSPO, you may ask? An OSPO functions as a center of excellence in organizations. Organizations could be companies, they could be universities, or even governments. And OSPOs, they typically take care of open source consumption and contribution. Their goal is to encourage best practices around open source adoption, and through industry services, they're known to actually accelerate innovation. So F5 created an OSPO. Hey, so now what? So what has the F5 open source program office been up to since it was formed? Let's step to the next phase in the open source journey. Firstly, we delivered an open source strategy, and this was based on research findings on the state of open source at F5, on industry, and on peer insights. Speaking of our findings at F5, here are some of the highlights of what open source looked like at F5 at that time. When it came to using open source, the current usage policy needed to better address the new ways that the products were being delivered, for example, through containers or through SaaS. White Source, now Mend, had actually been brought in as a tool to help consolidate the efforts company-wide, and product and security teams were already collaborating and mapping out what this would look like. And they were looking for compliance guidance from OSPO and from legal. Additionally, approvals were happening over email, and these were often hard to track. As far as contributing to third-party open source projects, early work had actually began to revamp the open source contribution policy to encourage participation. Contribution approval requests, they happened over email just as they did for usage, and response times could sometimes be slow. We also found that we didn't do a really good job promoting some of the key contributions that were happening internally or externally. For example, there were really good contributions happening to Cilium and to Porter projects. When we looked at F5 in terms of how it was doing in publishing and open source projects, We found that many projects across F5, they weren't actively supporting their communities and accepting contributions. Many of our projects were missing important files like contributor guidelines and code of conduct. These files are really important when you want to encourage contribution and also make the community feel welcome. We also found that F5 had consolidated GitHub billing across its properties, and doing that, they had actually done a first round of a project audit. But there were no clear guidelines about how projects in GitHub should be organized. And this all led to the formation of the strategy and the key parts of the plan. Let's walk through that. The first was just a business case for what an open source strategy at F5 should look like. We then followed up with an overview of open source, just to for people who weren't kind of clear on what open source was. And we talked about the main engagement models, which is around using open source, contributing to open source, and publishing open source. Around each of these engagement models, we talked about what the different benefits were. For example, what is the benefit of using open source? The risks, for example, what are the risks of actually producing open source projects? We discussed the current F5 status, F5 specific challenges, and what the future vision would look like for F5 in each of these different areas. After this, we outlined the opportunities that open source could unlock for F5 to help with its strategic and business goals. Then there was a recommendation on how the OSPO should be structured and resourced, as well as all of the different key partners we would need to get the job done. And finally, we delivered an execution roadmap with some objectives and key results for the short term. With this, the OSPO started executing on the strategy in early 2022. Now, as we go into the execution, I'll be grouping this into 4 pillars. The first is laying the foundations for the program. The second is modernizing the practices around how we consume open source. The third is supporting the work around contributing to the open source ecosystem. And the fourth goes around focusing on the community, which ties some of these pieces together. First, let's talk about programs. So we think that the key foundational work includes strategy, research, hiring, developing a metrics frameworks, and building out a communication and a tooling infrastructure. Let's see how we have done. Now, the open source strategy, as I said before, that was the highest priority task, and this was delivered in late 2021. It resulted in leadership buy-in, which helped unlock the budgeting and the resources that we need to form the OSPO. From that base, we were able to hire 2 of the 3 key roles that we needed. They are now actively working on building out the programs we need to support our work. We also set up key channels for communication, support, and to help with the community building that we needed down the line. We also started working with key internal partners to build out a platform for internal tooling, as well as exploring prototyping different integrations that we needed for tools such as Jira. The second pillar of our work involves modernizing our practices around open source consumption. On the compliance front, what we're doing is we're updating the open source usage policy and procedures to match product development processes. For example, apps are increasingly being distributed using containers. There are different approaches to building with containers that have trade-offs around compliance and customer needs that we need to think about. We're also revisiting what we provide to customers based on recent updates to the software bill of materials requirements. The third pillar of our work involves encouraging and supporting our open source contribution efforts. We had an early win when we updated the contribution policy, and we did this to eliminate many of the roadblocks to contribute to open source. For example, people no longer need to have approval to contribute to side projects under certain conditions. We really want to encourage people to actually contribute to the ecosystem. We're working on an updated contribution license approval management tooling. And with the contribution license approving tooling, what we need to do is we want to make it really easy to onboard new people who want to work on the projects and help encourage external contributions. We're building out a dashboard to provide visibility to open source maintainers and stakeholders on how our projects are doing. Now, in the fourth pillar, we want to focus on our open source community, and this includes building a community internal and also showing up to the community external. For the internal community, we formed cross-functional partnerships with some of the key stakeholders like legal, the Office of the CISO, engineering, inner source, and the NGINX open source community team. We're partnering closely with the NGINX OSS community team on the community building efforts. For example, we worked with them closely on a code of conduct update. We're also working on an internal website to provide guides, training modules, and opportunities for F5 employees to participate and become open source ambassadors. We feel that this is going to be a way for us to kind of grow our influence internally and help people get excited about open source. For the external community, we championed F5 joining the Open Source Security Foundations, where we feel that we can actually bring some of our work in security to that community and also learn some of the industry best practices. We're also helping out and coordinating the participation in various working groups. We're participating in conferences, including Open Source Festival that happened earlier in Africa. We participated in Upstream, a recent Open Source Summit in Austin, and this one. I'm proud of the work that we've done so far to start shifting the open source mindset at F5. However, we're still at the beginning of our journey. So let's go and talk about what we are doing next. In addition to what we're already working on, here are a few things that we're looking to do in the next 6 to 12 months. When it comes to programs, we really want to build out a metrics framework, and this is key to help demonstrate progress and show impact to leadership. This impact will be shown through program reports with versions that we can actually share externally as well. When it comes to using open source, we're working with internal partners to operationalize the open source consumption reviews. And this is a lot of work is happening in different buckets, but we want to string along everything really well so that people can have a good experience, because we really care about the internal developer experience. On open source contributions, we want to roll out an online approval process for creating new projects. And this is going to help with some of the hygiene that we want to do to make sure that projects are actually showing up well in the community, including having some of those key files that we pointed out were missing before. We also want to build out the tools to help project maintainers better manage their projects and their collaborators. For example, some project maintainers want one central place where they can easily add external contributors to their projects. For the community, we plan to launch an F5 open source website where we want to highlight F5's work in open source, not just in NGINX, but across some of the different properties that we're working on and the different product groups. Internally, we want to create an ambassador program, as I mentioned before, to promote an open source culture. We're also looking for opportunities to get plugged into existing and planned engineering onboarding and training experiences. We find that a lot of people want to contribute to open source, but they may not know how to do so for the very first time. And they may not know what are all of the different things that we have been working on. So we plan to do this so that we can actually spread the knowledge of what we're working on internally. I've condensed a lot of the future that we're working on in one slide, but there's a lot going on, and we're excited to see this all come to life. F5 is committed to open source, and NGINX was a key factor in driving this decision. We've shown commitment by putting together an overarching open source program office to support NGINX open source and other efforts across the company. We'd love for you to stay engaged, to join us and build with us as we continue our journey of innovation through open source. Thank you.